Good evening. Welcome one and all to the seventh in a series of lectures in the Ohio Bicentennial Distinguished Lecture Series on Ohio and the World. I'm Richard Sisson, co-organizer with my colleague in the Department of History, Professor Jeffrey Parker, of this series. We are very honored this evening to have with us the chairman of the Board of Trustees of The Ohio State University. He is one of the busiest people in this state, and that has been true for a considerable period of time. Zohir Sophia is chairman of Sophia & Company, Inc., here in Columbus, Ohio. It's a private investment firm, provides advisory services in mergers and acquisitions and capital formation, and investment and business strategy. He is president of the Stanbury Group, a registered investment advisor that provides investment advice to individuals, businesses, and institutional investors. And he is co-managing partner with A. Michael Lipper of L&S Partners. Previously, and for a substantial period of time, he was president, COO, treasurer, and director of Huntington Bank Shares, a very important institution here in Columbus, Ohio. He has also been dedicated to civic activities, to building social capital, to providing support to extraordinarily important public and civic institutions and cultural institutions. He was founder and is past president of the Columbus Council on World Affairs. He has served as the chair of the Columbus chapter of Young Presidents Organizations and is chair of the Board of Trustees, or has served as chair of the Board of Trustees of the Columbus School for Girls. He is a past president and honorary trustee for life of the Board of Trustees of the Columbus Symphony Orchestra, and was president at a time in which that orchestra started to grow to national prominence. He is chair of the Board of Trustees of this university with a deep commitment to this university and to education here and elsewhere, and it's my honor to introduce him to you tonight. Join me in welcoming Mr. Zohir Sophia.
Dick, thank you for this wonderful, kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, we are delighted to have you with us tonight. Of all the community services I have been involved with through the years, one of the most rewarding has been the honor of association of The Ohio State University, a great educational and research institution. On behalf of the Board of Trustees of The Ohio State University, it's my privilege and pleasure to welcome you all here to this event and to all future events for this Ohio Bicentennial Distinguished Lecture Series entitled Ohio and the World. This series is one of the several contributions of The Ohio State University to celebrate our bicentennial statehood. The series is significant in a number of ways, indeed in many important respects. It brings the work of eminent teacher and scholar from the art and sciences to public forum, such as this one here tonight. Those scholars are dedicated to instilling the quest for knowledge in our students and the public at large. Plato defined a great teacher as one who holds before the young a vision of greatness. That sums up my admiration for Ohio State faculty, members and scholars, and Ohio State education. The art and sciences are at the core of teaching and learning at all great universities, such as Ohio State. and this will continue to be the case in the future. It's true not only here, but nationally and globally. This series is significant in that it examines the history, culture, politics, economy, society of our state from the period of 1753 to the period of 2053, from this contest of its creation to speculations about its future. It's significant that in that lecture are being presented at various venues around our state, as well as here in Columbus. These venues include Athens, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Dayton, Newark, and Toledo, every region of the state of Ohio. It's significant that all those lecturers at all these venues are meeting with high school students and with teachers to bring the environment of university teaching and research into the classroom of our public school here in Columbus as well as around the state of Ohio. It's significant that it's being archived and made widely available by video through modern technology of the web, as well as through our true and trusted old-fashioned technology, of course, books. These will be available for your purchases by the end of the year. I hope you will share my sense of pride when we observe that 50 years from now, 100 years from now, the future citizen of Ohio will be here to see, hear, and read what we do here tonight. It's now my honor to introduce one of our distinguished and leading faculty member of The Ohio State University, Professor Paul Beck. Dr. Beck is a renowned scholar. He's a professor and chairman of the Department of Political Sciences. Despite having received his doctorate from the school up north, University of Michigan, in 1971, he is one of the nation's leading experts on American elections, public opinion, and political parties. His research on the sources of citizen voting choices and opinion and the development of American political parties has been published in the top professional journals. Dr. Beck has chaired many of the important task forces in the academic arena. He has been awarded the University Distinguished Service Award extended by the President of The Ohio State University and the University Senate. Please join me in welcoming Paul Beck, who will then introduce our speaker for the evening.
Thank you very much. It's with special pleasure that I introduce to you tonight the speaker, a colleague of mine in the Department of Political Science, Professor Herb Asher. Herb joined the faculty at Ohio State in 1970 and has had a distinguished career here ever since. As a political scientist, he is well known for his scholarly work in the areas of public opinion, voting, elections, campaigns, legislative politics, and statistical research methods. His most recent book focuses on the role of labor unions in electoral politics. His book on public opinion polling is the most valuable and readable guide that I know to this important campaign industry. He also served as the co-editor of one of the profession's top scholarly journals. Among students on this campus, Herb Asher is revered as one of Ohio State's best teachers. His courses on Ohio politics and campaign politics are the most popular and most memorable on this campus. He is one of the professors that students remember fondly long after they have taken his courses, and these students can be found in important positions throughout the state and beyond. Herb also has been a valued advisor to university presidents since Ed Jennings, and has served them as a valuable link to state government, a true representative of the faculty and the university more generally. The best advisors to leaders are those who are willing, in the words of Aaron Wodolski, to speak truth to power. Herb Asher excels at telling it like it is, without any special pleading on his part or a hidden agenda for himself. His sound judgment has mattered, and mattered very importantly for the university. Professor Asher has contributed in important ways to his community in Columbus and in Ohio as well. He has shared his keen insights on Ohio political life with leaders and with the public through the media, so much so that the other paper just the other day editorialized that it was time for reporters to, quote, leave Herb Asher alone, end quote. He currently serves as chair of the Ohio Ethics Commission, president of the Board of Trustees of Community Research Partners, and a member of leadership groups of other important community organizations. In his 33 years at Ohio State and in Columbus and in Ohio, in all these ways, Herb has more than overcome, as we Buckeyes like to say, the disadvantage of also having received his PhD from the University of Michigan. Nonetheless, there is no one better positioned to take stock of contemporary Ohio, and I look forward to hearing his remarks. You join me in welcoming Herb Asher.
Zohair, thank you for being here. Dick and Jeffrey, thank you for organizing this series. This has been wonderful. Paul, thank you for that very generous introduction, but one of the reasons why Paul was so generous is that we were at Michigan at the same time. And I actually have more evidence and ammunition on him than he has on me. And if you've ever heard stories about encyclopedia salespeople going door to door trying to sell encyclopedias, and you'd say, who would ever buy an encyclopedia from a door-to-door salesman? There he is. And that's the least of the stories that I could tell you. So we had mutual assured deterrence going on here this evening. My assignment tonight is to talk about Ohio in 2003. And in one sense, that's a more difficult assignment because we're all experiencing Ohio in 2003. And I think all of us have our own vantage points and our own expertise and our own views and our own opinions. And so I will really welcome questions and comments at the end, and I think we'll have a lot of fun with that. What I want to do tonight is really talk about where we are as a state, where we've been, and then I think in the final lecture of the series, former President Kirwan will be coming back to really look at Ohio from the perspective of 2053, looking back to the choices that probably we should be making today. So let me begin by just pointing out here that during the administration of Governor Richard Celeste, the Ohio Department of Development adopted as the state's travel and tourism slogan, Ohio, the heart of it all. And there was even a song commissioned with that title that was sung by England Dan Seals. And I've learned that there's a generation gap, that the more mature among us know who England Dan was, and some of the younger ones do not. But here indeed is the record. Now, we didn't get a phonograph for tonight, but here indeed is the record. And for the younger members of the audience, it's a 45. Actually, I should back up. It's a record. It's not, but so anybody who would like to borrow this and listen. So in fact, we adopted that as our travel and tourism slogan. Ohio, the heart of it all. But in the 1980s, Ohio was not the heart of it all. That slogan would better have described Ohio of a century earlier, when Ohio was the engine of America's Industrial Revolution, when Ohio was the economic and political powerhouse of the United States. A century ago, Ohio had unique advantages that catapulted us to a national leadership position. We had location and transportation routes. We had the natural resources and fuels to fuel our industrial plant. We had access to raw materials like iron ore. We had human capital of many kind. We had inventors and laborers and entrepreneurs and capitalists. And I'll say more about those assets later. The key point is that a century ago, Ohio was a destination of choice. a place where Americans went to enhance their economic standing. And I don't want to overly romanticize the Industrial Revolution in Ohio, because there certainly were many harsh aspects to it, including blatant exploitation of workers and appalling working conditions and outright disregard for the environment at that time. But nevertheless, Ohio was a destination for Americans seeking jobs and opportunity, and Ohio was indeed the heart of it all. And Ohio maintained its preeminent position as an industrial powerhouse through the middle of the 20th century, in part because of the massive mobilization of World War II. Today, Ohio's travel and tourism slogan is Ohio, so much to discover. And of course, what is meant by this slogan is that there are so many wonderful things to see and do in Ohio. Come to Ohio and see what we have to offer. But there's another meaning, a more depressing meaning, that we can assign to the slogan, Ohio, so much to discover, namely that we here in Ohio, the people of Ohio, our political leadership, our business leaders, our schools and our universities and others, all have so much to discover, have so much to learn about what it would take to move Ohio back to a leadership role among the 50 states. For it is clear as the 21st century began, Ohio had slipped, that we were no longer the heart of it all. And this slippage had been occurring for 50 years. Many of us have heard the numbers. Our per capita personal income, once above the national average, is now below, and the gap between Ohio and the nation is widening. Likewise, population growth and job growth in Ohio are below the national average. For example, between July of 2000 and July of 2002, Ohio ranked 49th among the 50 states in net domestic migration, meaning more people moved out of Ohio to other states than came to Ohio from other states. And when international migration was factored in, Ohio ranked dead last in overall population growth. And the Ohio Board of Regents, the coordinating body for higher education, regularly cites statistics demonstrating that Ohio is an undereducated state. And by that they mean that at every level of post-high school education, whether you're talking about community colleges or universities and bachelor degrees or graduate programs and advanced degrees, Ohio falls below the national average in the percentage of her population who have achieved any of these levels of advanced post-high school education. And I'm not saying we rank below the #1 state, I'm saying we rank below the national average. And undoubtedly, this situation is a reflection of our traditional industrial economy in which post-high school education was not needed in order to get a well-paying factory job. But even today, as the old industrial economy has shrunk, and even though we have a high school graduation rate in Ohio above the national average, that's good news. Our high school graduation rate is above the national average. The percentage of Ohio high school graduates who go on to college even today is below the national average. And in fact, the gap between baccalaureate degree attainment in Ohio and the national average, that gap is widening. And it may be that Ohio has distinct subcultures. For example, rural Appalachian whites, central city African Americans, and the urban white working class that do not look to higher education for economic advancement, whether because of historical circumstances, perceptual barriers, financial impediments, or whatever the causes might be. There are other data that I can cite, and I'm trying hard not to be sort of a shameless shill for higher education, but let me give you one other statistic here. If we were to examine the change in median annual income in Ohio between 1973 and 2000 for males 25 and over, there are a lot of conditions here, for males 25 and over, adjusted for inflation, we find that controlling for educational attainment, meaning degree attainment here, we find that only those males that had at least a bachelor's degree actually experienced real income growth. That those with only some college actually experienced a 12% decline, while high school graduates only in this time period lost about 25% in effective earnings. The lesson is clear. Higher education makes a difference in earnings power. And yet the state of Ohio typically, and not just today, we're talking about a longer term period, typically the state of Ohio ranks about 40th among the 50 states in its financial support for higher education, and Ohio typically ranks somewhere among the top 10 states in its tuition costs. So we really do not have a very healthy situation. The challenges facing us here in Ohio are not unique to Ohio, but they are more difficult to Ohio because of our heavy dependence on manufacturing and heavy industry as sources of jobs and wealth. This historical and continuing reliance on manufacturing has made Ohio more vulnerable to changes in the national and international economies than other states that never enjoyed our incredible industrial base. So let me first now review some of the factors that made Ohio the industrial leader of the United States, and then discuss why these factors no longer advantage Ohio as much. And as I mentioned at the outset of my remarks, 4 interrelated advantages that Ohio had a century ago were location, transportation routes, energy sources, and raw materials. To fuel an industrial revolution, one needs energy. And Ohio had an abundant supply of energy, and not only of coal, but also of oil and natural gas. One also needs iron ore to process into steel and then into other products, and Ohio had access to the fields in Minnesota and the transportation routes to bring the iron ore to Ohio. When finished products were ready for shipment, Ohio had the benefit of being within a 500-mile radius of most of the nation's population. And we had the transportation routes. We had the rail and the roads and the water routes to get our products to the market. Our industrial revolution also needed human capital, and Ohio was blessed to have 3 basic kinds of human capital. We had the low-skilled and unskilled laborers to man our mines and mills and factories, and many of these workers migrated to Ohio from the South or from the East Coast, or came almost directly to Ohio from Europe. We also had the inventors and the scientists and the engineers who designed our new industrial processes, who built the machinery that ran our factories, and who designed new products for the marketplace. And we also had the entrepreneurs with their financial savvy to amass the capital to build our amazing industrial plant. All the pieces came together in Ohio to build an industrial powerhouse. But today, these pieces do not add up to expansive economic success and prosperity. Large numbers of unskilled workers are no longer an economic boon, as many of the jobs they held have disappeared or have been replaced by machines and robotics. And yet our undereducated adult population remains a legacy from a bygone era. Our location and transportation advantages are no longer as important. The center of gravity of the American population has moved south and west. More importantly, revolutions in transportation and freight hauling, logistics and distribution systems now mean that products can be manufactured abroad and still be brought to markets quickly and efficiently here at home. And the entrepreneurs and inventors are not nearly as prominent in Ohio today as they were a century ago. When we look at specific industries within Ohio, we again see patterns of decline because of environmental, safety, and health concerns. Our abundant coal, and we surely have abundant coal in Ohio, but our abundant coal does not do for Ohio what oil and natural gas do for the economies of other states. The steel industry in Ohio and other states, once a source of numerous well-paying jobs, is today a skeleton of what it had been just 35 years ago. The rapid decline of the steel industry in the Mahoning Valley in the early 1970s disrupted the lives of thousands of Ohioans and their families in a region that is still hurting today. And we can blame the decline of the steel industry on many factors, both domestic and international. At home, we can point to bad management and investment decisions and the failure to modernize our facilities, or we can point to the appetites of labor unions and the management that fed those appetites. On the international level, we can blame unfair foreign competition and illegal practices such as dumping, and we can even acknowledge that those nations whose steel production capabilities were destroyed in World War II ultimately enjoyed a competitive advantage when they rebuilt a modern, more efficient steel production capacity. But whatever the reasons, steel is no longer the powerhouse it once was in Ohio's economy. The picture in the automotive and related industries is more positive than is the case for coal and steel. Today, Ohio is the second leading vehicle-producing state in the nation. But even here, there are challenges, both domestic and international. The loss of market share by the American automobile companies is an economic reality. And that loss was partially due to the fuel-inefficient and defective cars that characterized the 1960s and 1970s, and which were no match at the time for their German and Japanese competitors. Today, the number of foreign competitors has grown even more, and what constitutes a domestic versus a foreign-made car is not at all clear anymore. Parts made here, assembled there, parts made there, assembled here. The key point, though, is that there is excess capacity in the automobile industry. There is. And that means there are going to be efforts by the American automobile companies to downsize and to shift production to cheaper venues. Thus, as strong and as successful as our automobile industry is in Ohio, we can't count upon it as the source of a growing number of new, well-paying jobs. We'll do well just to hold on to the jobs we have there. Now, why do we care so much about manufacturing jobs? The answer is very, very simple. Those jobs tended to pay well, and they provided secure employment to citizens without post-high school education in many cases. Whereas manufacturing jobs once constituted more than 40% of Ohio jobs, today they comprise less than 20% of our jobs. And yet this is a 20% we can't ignore because they are well-paying jobs. And indeed, Ohio must look to new manufacturing, new products, new industrial processes, new invention and discovery to shore up the manufacturing sector of our economy. And I'll return to this point later. But globalization is a fact of life. When so many jobs are exportable because of cheaper overseas costs and amazingly efficient transportation systems to ship goods and merchandise to the United States, it becomes clear that the global economic competition has become even more fierce and challenging than it was in the past. Now, ideally, our national government in negotiating trade agreements with other nations will be tough on such issues as working conditions and environmental standards, because if we're not tough on those issues, then the existing comparative advantages of our foreign competitors will in fact be further and unfairly magnified. So it's very important that we make the playing field as level as we can, but that playing field is changing. And no matter how much we want to protect and preserve our traditional well-paying manufacturing jobs, we certainly cannot expect our older industries and our traditional product lines to be the source of major new job growth. And we're not just talking about closed steel plants in Youngstown or shuttered machine tool factories in Cleveland. The Columbus Dispatch not long ago did a particularly poignant series of stories about the impact of globalization on a shoe factory right down the road in Nelsonville and the awful consequences for that local community. Globalization and its consequences are particularly divisive issues in Ohio, especially as related to free trade agreements such as NAFTA. Proponents of such agreements argue that the opening of markets will eventually create more jobs and wealth here at home and abroad, They further assert that it is better to channel international economic changes through multinational agreements that provide some assurances about environmental standards and working conditions. And then also citing the needs of shareholders and stockholders, proponents also argue that businesses will be more profitable if they can bring products to the market using cheaper overseas labor working in a more pro-business regulatory environment. Opponents of such agreements as NAFTA argue that they result in the deindustrialization of the American and Ohio economies, with many of our best-paying jobs being shipped abroad. Now, no matter one's stance on this issue, and it is a divisive issue in Ohio, and no matter what the ultimate trade-offs are, Ohio, as a traditional manufacturing state, has more at risk in the short term with the loss of high-wage jobs. The issue for Ohio is what will replace the good jobs that we are losing. How do we lessen the negative impact of globalization, preserve as many of our current jobs as we can, and yet position and transform Ohio so that there will be new opportunities and good jobs for Ohioans? This truly is the fundamental question facing our state. Now, although the American economy is currently not in a recession, as you know, the economic recovery has been weak, particularly with respect to job growth. And indeed, jobs are still being lost, and the jobs are particularly being lost in the manufacturing sector. And Ohio, in the last 2 years, has lost 2% of its manufacturing jobs. The downward trend is continuing, so there really is a crisis here. Now, not only have the world and the international economy changed on Ohio, but so has American domestic politics and policymaking. We as a nation made decisions that guaranteed that the South and West would grow and prosper by building their infrastructure, cheap electricity, cheap water, roads and airports, and so on. Can you imagine living in Arizona or Southern California or South Florida without air conditioning or abundant water? Building the infrastructure for these regions of the country made America stronger. But it also made these areas competition for Ohio's jobs and people. And then, of course, there's the problem of cold, gray Ohio winters. I shudder to think how many Ohioans who discovered Arizona for the first time at the national championship football game this past January will eventually end up there because there wasn't a cloud in the sky in 4 days. There's a humorous email circulating about what it takes to really understand Ohio and be a true Ohioan. And it has a number of guidelines in this email. And one thing that it says here is that really to be a true Ohioan, you have to know the geography of Florida. A real Ohioan may not be able to tell you where Toledo is, but they know the exact distance from Fort Myers to Naples. And why? Because all Ohioans go to Florida in the winter, or perhaps plan to when they retire. And if you can't afford to spend the winter in Ohio, if you can't afford to spend the winter in Florida, you use the official state excuses, which is that you stay here in Ohio in the winter because you really do enjoy the change of season. You'd be lying, but that's okay because we all do that. Now, pardon me for being so provincial, but when we made these investment decisions in the South and West that strengthened our nation, as I said before, we created major competitors for economic growth. And as population flowed to the Sun Belt, to the South and West and Florida and all that, the political clout of our region of the country diminished, even as regionalism in American politics became pronounced on a number of issues. And let me just talk here about two major issues to illustrate the point of regionalism: the savings and loan scandal and the renewal of the Clean Air Act in the early 1990s. The problem of failed savings and loan institutions was concentrated in the South and the Southwest. But we adopted a national solution to the problem costing hundreds of billions of dollars. All regions of the country anteed up to solve a problem that was concentrated in one region. But when the problem was clean air, all regions did not ante up. We in Ohio and other major polluters had the burden placed heavily upon us, a decision of Congress and the administration that hurt our industry and our competitiveness. Now, perhaps this was fair, because we are certainly a major source of pollution, but a different choice that shared the costs more broadly across the 50 states would have been beneficial to Ohio. Now, one promising development at the national level is that even as our representation in Congress has shrunk, we currently have many members of the U.S. House of Representatives from Ohio in key political party and committee leadership positions. And more importantly, it appears that the Ohio congressional delegation is gradually becoming more like the Texas delegation in collectively looking out for the interests of Ohio, and that's a very, very good development. Now, in addition to the challenges that Ohio faces because of the global economy and because of the changing shape of American politics, another major obstacle that Ohio has as a state is we have an incredibly difficult time as a state coming together to achieve common purposes. And this happens for a number of reasons. And first and foremost is the regionalism of the state of Ohio produced by a highly dispersed population. Unlike other major northern industrial states such as Illinois, Michigan, and New York, all of which have or had a dominant population center such as Chicago, Detroit, and New York City, Ohio has a much more geographically dispersed population. 50 years ago, Ohio was the only state in the nation to have 8 cities with population in excess of 100,000 people. These cities were referred to as the 8 that made the state great, not to be confused with the 8 presidents of the United States that Ohio claims. And there's been a lot of competition among these cities and regions. Indeed, in the 1990s, the Toledo Blade, the major newspaper in Toledo, began a movement called the Other Ohio, which was intended as a coalition against the dominance of the 3 Cs, Cincinnati, Cleveland, and Columbus. The Blade raged, and if you know the Toledo Blade, it rages at times. The Blade raged that Toledo and the rest of the state were being shafted, and again, this is the Blade, were being shafted by the 3 Cs. The Blade even hinted at Toledo's secession from Ohio, although my sense is that unless you plan on going it alone, you should never threaten secession without first knowing if someone really wants you. But these distinct regional population centers, with their differing economic challenges, result in competition for state support. And even academic programs take on a pork barrel aura. Certainly one reason why Ohio has so many public law schools, we have 5 of them, and so many public medical schools, 6 of them, is the fact that we have so many population centers. But heaven protect the public officials who propose to shut down one of these facilities. The regional outcry will be loud. And the many PhD programs that Ohio's public universities have, are almost as sacrosanct. And the notion of PhD program elimination is almost as divisive as the demise of a medical or law school. For 20 years, I've been claiming, only half facetiously, that Ohio is not a state, but it really is a series of city-states. Cincinnati is not in Ohio. It's in a 3-state region of Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. And Cincinnatians are just as likely to look to Lexington or Bloomington or South Bend as they are to Columbus and Cleveland. Toledo really is in the Detroit media market, while Youngstown can be seen as part of the Pennsylvania Steel Belt. Cleveland is truly, for me, an East Coast city with its rich ethnic and racial composition and its declining industrial base, while Columbus is much more of a Sun Belt city with its diversified economy and its younger and more educated population. Because of our many population centers and media markets, there are no dominant statewide media, even though at the local level we have some very powerful media, especially the newspapers in our major cities. But at the state level, it's very difficult for the media to play a traditional agenda-setting role in which they place issues on the state agenda for public and political consideration. A major investigative series conducted by one Ohio newspaper may receive little or no coverage in other Ohio cities. And once we get beyond our cities, we must recognize that Ohio is a remarkably diverse state. We have old suburbs and new suburbs. We have urban townships and rural townships. We have ring counties that are growing fantastically, and we have counties, particularly in the Appalachian region, that have been in a long-term decline, and even today are suffering from economic distress that could be best described by the term depression rather than recession. Some of our political leaders still have difficulty understanding how the world has changed on Ohio. Obviously, Ohio, like many other states, has serious budget problems and cannot fund services, including higher education, at the level it might want to. But one gets the sense that there has historically been a much lower sense of urgency in funding higher education in Ohio than in other states. And again, perhaps that was due to our older industrial economy, in which a college degree or any post-high school education was simply not necessary to get a well-paying job. But that traditional industrial world has been changing and shrinking, and we in Ohio have not reacted in a strategic and effective fashion. At times, our political leadership has been insensitive to the changing national and world economies. For example, Governor Rhodes, who really was one of our most creative governors. If you actually knew Governor Rhodes and knew the ideas that he had, he could spin off 1,000 ideas at one time. They weren't all good ideas, but he was one of our most creative governors, and who really was the governor responsible for building the physical plant for higher education. His mantra was that there'd be a higher education institution within 30 miles of every Ohioan, and there'd be a highway to get you to that institution. The physical plant was a high priority, but what about the operations of those universities? What about paying for the activities there? That was not a priority for Governor Rhodes. His economic development strategies were mixed, but one of them involved Rhodes's Raiders. And Rhodes's Raiders were a group of people that tried to lure smokestack industries to Ohio. And let me say, thank goodness that Governor Rhodes had some successes here. The Honda plant is really attributable to Governor Rhodes, and that's been a wonderful benefit. And he got the GM plant in Lordstown. So those were very, very, very good things. But overall, a focus on a smokestack strategy could not be the future of Ohio, because the smokestack industry as a source of jobs was declining. It was inevitable, given changes in the global economic order. Governor Voinovich, to me, was one of our most effective and sensible governors. And here I'll make a little partisan comment. And today, as a United States Senator, he is reinforcing his reputation for fiscal integrity and political independence by resisting President Bush's call for a large tax cut, although I think he was just snookered a little by some of his Republican Senate colleagues, but that's just an aside. But one thing that Governor Voinovich had some difficulty with was appreciating the research mission of universities. I recall at the kickoff of his re-election campaign at the then Great Southern Hotel in Columbus, the governor spoke eloquently and thoughtfully about the accomplishments and priorities of his first term and his plans for his second term. And Governor Voinovich explained how 3 strikes and you're out was poor public policy and poor fiscal policy. He explained how welfare reform could be made to work and he addressed so many issues, so many key issues with insight and savvy. Then the governor talked about making all of Ohio into a research park. And so my ears perked up, all of Ohio into a research park. But then he followed that comment by looking at the college students in the audience and saying proudly to them and everyone else in the room, and so I say to the students, we got those faculty members back in the classroom teaching and not doing that research. And somewhere, there's a disconnect between the aspiration to make the state a research park and the attack on faculty-based research. It's cliche today to say that Ohio is a state at the crossroads. Indeed, it may be more accurate to say that Ohio has been at the crossroads for decades, yet still uncertain about which path to take. At some point, Ohio must end the drift and consciously choose to build its future in particular directions. Now, no state can determine its own destiny in an interdependent global economy, but states can make some choices to enhance their chances of being a winner in this global competition. Ohio is late getting into the new economy knowledge business competition. We know that strategic financial investments will be required, yet we also know that we cannot simply throw money at problems and spread that money around too widely. But we also know that we must be sensitive to Ohio's regional differences if we are to avoid the regional quarrels that might derail any state initiatives. At the minimum, and here we've had some successes, we must review the statutory and regulatory environment to make sure that there are no unnecessary impediments to our transformation to the knowledge economy. And here the state of Ohio and the universities have made some progress. For example, Ohio today has protections that did not exist 10 years ago for intellectual property for faculty members at public universities. And recently, the state of Ohio made it possible for faculty members to benefit by the commercialization of their own invention and discovery, therefore enhancing the likelihood that the commercialization and the associated job development would occur here in Ohio. And this was accomplished with an appropriate sensitivity to potential ethical and conflict of issue concerns. We also know that we must make some difficult investment, that is spending, as well as reallocation decisions at all levels of our economy. And to do this wisely, we must enlist the involvement of the business community in the same way that the Business Roundtable, an Ohio CEO organization, and Procter & Gamble in particular, played a key role in getting primary and secondary education performance, accountability, and funding on the public agenda. We also need our Ohio Chamber of Commerce and the Ohio Manufacturing Association to broaden their agenda to go beyond lower taxes and less regulation. We need the business community to step up as a partner, as a constructive critic, and as an outspoken and demanding customer for the products of the new economy. Leadership must come not only from statewide business organizations, but must also come from regional entities, such as our local chambers of commerce and growth associations. For example, in the last 6 years, right here in Columbus, the Greater Columbus Chamber of Commerce has become much more active in two critical areas: the Columbus Public Schools and regional economic growth strategies. With respect to the schools, the Chamber has become a constructive and supportive critic of the schools, in contrast to its posture of indifference and disdain just a decade ago. It's absolutely critical to have the business community take a posture of tough love toward our challenged school districts with the aim of improving student performance and outcomes. Likewise, the Columbus Chamber has taken the lead in bringing together entities like universities, municipalities, and businesses to form new partnerships. Every region in Ohio is now conducting an inventory of its assets and advantages and is trying to forge new partnerships. We also know that our colleges and universities, while justifiably dismayed by their low priority in state funding, must recognize that the state is not the only solution and must make tough internal reallocation decisions, as well as seek other sources of funding and build new partnerships with businesses and with our local communities. How universities accomplish this without overly compromising their essential character will be a challenge. Colleges and universities must be leading advocates for the benefits of the knowledge economy for Ohioans. At the same time, they must not get so totally focused on jobs and economic growth that they distort and diminish their broader contributions. If we in higher education talk only about the economy, we should not be surprised if some politicians downtown come up with the bad idea to support only those university academic programs that contribute directly and immediately to jobs and the economy. We surely don't want to suggest that engineers, scientists, doctors, and accountants are important, while philosophers, historians, artists, and political scientists are peripheral. And fortunately, here at Ohio State University, we have a chairman of the board, Zahir Sophia, who is absolutely committed to the centrality of the arts and sciences and the priority of the arts and sciences at this university. And we also need to remember that the ideas and inventions that may lead to commercial applications and jobs and wealth can come from unpredictable, even unlikely sources. I actually once had a good idea, but that's a different story. Our primary and secondary schools have a responsibility also, and they will have to renew their commitment to performance and accountability. After all, there's no way that Ohio will progress if too many children are left behind. Everyone involved with our public schools must be in it for the long haul, because dramatic improvement will not occur overnight. We must make sure that our public schools are on the right track and then help them gain momentum. But even as our colleges and universities, our primary and secondary schools, our regional and state business organizations carry out their responsibilities to build a stronger Ohio, state government itself must provide determined leadership to move Ohio forward. Governor Taft's Third Frontier initiative will be very critical and merits voter support this coming November. But even here, the new state investment is relatively small. And how frustrating that this very creative initiative, which was outlined in 2002, will have to wait until late 2003 to be adopted, assuming the voters agree. Our current political leaders must realize that every year that they defer making key choices and strategic investments, Ohio loses more ground because other states are not standing still even in difficult budget times. And Ohio is entering this competition at a disadvantage since other states already have a more extensive track record in making investments in their citizens and their economies. And I should point out that some of these states are states that we used to laugh at. States are to the south of us, states like Georgia and North Carolina and even Kentucky. So as the state creates sorry for that, I'm sorry if anybody from Kentucky, but we need to in fact make tough choices. We need to make some tough choices. Now, as Ohio moves forward in its economic transformation, one asset we do have is a very enlightened media elite, particularly our major newspapers, which have been at the forefront promoting state and business and university initiatives to secure Ohio's future. Newspapers such as the Akron Beacon-Journal, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, the Columbus Dispatch, and the Dayton Daily News have repeatedly editorialized on behalf of higher education and the importance of the knowledge economy, and have sponsored important in-depth analyses of what Ohio must do to secure its future. For example, the Dayton Daily News just last year had a three-part series, which was a superb recitation of where Ohio has been and where it must go. And just 10 days ago, the lead editorial in the Sunday Cleveland Plain Dealer was an impassioned plea for a strong, consistent investment in higher education, with an accompanying warning in this editorial that political leadership will be applauded by the plain dealer and the failure to lead will be denounced. These are strong words from a newspaper, but truly appropriate to the serious decisions facing our Ohio. So what is our ultimate goal? We want Ohio to be a destination of choice once again, just as it was a century ago. A destination of choice will have good jobs, a good educational system, and a good quality of life. To achieve this will require ongoing leadership and commitment from the business, political, education, and media sectors of Ohio. And in doing this, we have to recognize there are no immediate solutions. We have to be in this for the long term, recognizing that not every specific investment or project or program will be successful. You know, earlier in my comments, I made reference to this email that's been going around about what it takes to really be, and understand Ohio. And the very last guideline in this email, the very last guideline says that if you want to sell something in Ohio, the best way to do it is to put the term Amish in front of it. Now, the product need not be genuinely Amish. That explains why some of our restaurants actually have Amish Mushu pork. But unfortunately, I do not think that if we simply say Amish higher education or Amish Ohio State University or Amish Third Frontier, I don't think that will get the job done. Instead, what we really have to do is adopt a long-term strategy that entails new partnerships and wise investments. And if we do this, the original words of our official state song, Beautiful Ohio, may once again ring true. And some of you know the original words, beautiful Ohio, in dreams again I see, visions of what used to be. But if we fail to do this, perhaps a paraphrase of our official state rock song would be more appropriate. Hang on, Ohio, hang on. Thank you very much, and I'd be delighted to try to answer any questions you might have. Angela, you had a question?
I'll help you, the mediator here. Questions? There gotta be questions everywhere, yeah.
Your comments on the issue of the funding of common schools.
I'm sorry, my comment on the issue of funding
The funding of the common schools.
Yeah, you know, this is an interesting issue, and obviously, as we just saw last week, the Ohio Supreme Court, while acknowledging that the system is still unconstitutional, has said they're not going to review it anymore. It's now back in the legislature's hand. And the Schools Coalition wants to claim that the state has done nothing. That's not true. The state has put substantial money into the schools and has put substantial money into school facilities. What the state has not done, I think, which is very, very significant, it has not reduced the reliance on the property tax. When you really look at the financial problems of schools, the school districts that are really hurting are school districts in rural areas that do not have much property, commercial or residential, to tax. Money isn't the primary problem for our urban school districts. They could use more money, but that's not really the issue. So one of the challenges we face here in Ohio is how do we provide more resources for those rural poor districts and try to provide more opportunity for the students down there. But we have put substantial money into primary and secondary education, both in terms of operations, and this whole school facilities thing is a new program that did not exist 10 years ago. We needed to do it because it turns out we had the worst physical plant for our public schools of any state in the nation. Yes.
The rear.
Dr. Escher, I have a question about the influence of the newspapers that you talked about.
Yeah.
And, I can definitely see that influencing a lot of people within the cities and people that are educated and pay attention to the papers. But as we've heard a lot of times, the state of Ohio seems to be somewhat uneducated and naive to a lot of things that are happening. So how well
Well, I think here that as much as we talk about grassroots, and I think as you, in an era of term limits, you talk about grassroots and trying to change public opinion, to me, though, leadership still matters. And leadership is an elite phenomenon. And what you really need here is some pressure put upon whether it's governors, legislators, county commissioners, whomever. Now, one source of pressure is from constituents, but, you know, I'm not sure you're ever going to hear the same kind of pressure for higher education as you might hear for primary and secondary education. And the reason you might not is that a lot of people don't perceive higher education as being in a crisis. You know, we'll never close our doors. We seem to be doing reasonably well. And a lot of the statistics that I've cited, you know, don't ring true. If you lived in Nelsonville, they'd ring true. If you lived in Youngstown, they'd ring true. If you live in Butler County, Geauga County, or Butler County, they don't ring true. There's lots of oases of prosperity. If you're in northeastern Franklin County and New Albany, where's the crisis? I think one of the things that's important here about what the plain dealer said, not that newspaper endorsements actually change a lot of votes, but here's the plain dealer saying, we're going to be watching you. It would be nice if, in fact, our business associations were actually stepping up to the plate and saying to our elected officials, this is a priority. This is, in fact, so important to our state that we think you should do this before you do other things. But, in fact, the strategy has to be multiple-pronged. When students, in fact, protest, I mean, you know, as our student governments did, it turns out that students have much more moral standing than when university lobbyists or presidents sort of ask for more resources. Why? Because lobbyists and presidents are expected to do that. When students and their parents back in the district, you know, start putting pressure on, that's helpful. But it's not an either-or thing, Eddie. I think here what the newspapers can do, because newspapers also represent part of the business elite of a community. You know, just recently, Ohio State University had a challenge in the state budget. The state did something that would have been particularly harmful to Ohio State, and as you know, with respect to the treatment of out-of-state and international graduate students. And our trustees, and I know Zuhair did this actually, called up key people, called up the Dispatch. We had an editorial in the Columbus Dispatch that literally named legislators by name and said, you're hurting your local university. And that decision was reversed, I think, the next day or two. So those kinds of things can be helpful, but I think the strategy has to be multiple-pronged. And I promise I will not give lectures to every other question that is asked.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, I work in the field of business history here, and especially industrial regions and high-tech areas. And I wonder if you're not being even too optimistic about Ohio. Have we not perhaps already blown it? What first-mover advantages, what comparative advantages do we have in trying to develop any kind of high-tech here that isn't being done better and more extensively somewhere else?
I think the way I would respond to that is that there are certain avenues of the new economy, particularly life sciences, health sciences, medicine, that are so extensive, and the resources that will be coming from the federal government and also from companies, the private sector as such, that we in Ohio don't have to be number one or number two or even number three to still bring to the state a lot of resources that potentially will have a wonderful benefit for our economy. And even though we're perhaps not as well positioned as some other states, when you look at the area of the life sciences, and you look at here Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati, and you look at university medical centers, and you look up at Cleveland at the Cleveland Clinic, and you look here at Ohio State, not only do we have a College of Medicine, but we have a College of Veterinary Medicine, and we have a College of Food, Agriculture, and Environmental Sciences. The synergies that might be there, I think, get us in the game. I think the point you're making, though, is a very good one, that as you sort of make these decisions, you need to do an inventory of your assets. Some of us would say that we had, in Columbus right here, the opportunity to take advantage of the information economy and the information revolution. Look what we had here. We had OCLC, we have Battelle, we had Chemical Abstracts, we have Ohio State University, and somehow it sort of passed us by. That might be an interesting case study of perhaps, I don't know the answer why it passed us by. I know we developed an Edison Center here that went belly up. But I think there's in some of these areas enough going on that even if we just got a piece of it, that would be a major benefit. Another area that might be important is Homeland Security. The synergy between Ohio State University and Battelle, and presumably the amount of money that will be out there at some point for Homeland Security initiatives, might be something that we would have comparative and competitive advantages. Yeah. Yeah, Merle?
Starting over here, yes. First, Angela wants the Amish Mushu pork recipe. Discuss funding for focusing on short-term revenue impact, job creation impact. What impact have term limits on the legislature had on that?
Well, just remember, the problems I'm talking about predate term limits. So we're not going to blame the fact that perhaps the legislature is not doing what we would like. We're not going to blame it on term limits or this legislature. That there really has been a tradition in Ohio where higher education really has not been, at least in terms of its operations, has not been a high priority. Now, I think term limits makes life more difficult, and term limits in the context of a budget crisis makes life even more difficult. So I think term limits has made leadership more difficult. I can tell you a couple of stories. I won't go into the details of this, but in a different era, back in the 1980s, when the state was in a little bit stronger an economic situation, and you also had, for example, a speaker by the name of Vern Rife who really ruled quite strongly. There's two programs I can tell you about that came to be. One was called the Research Challenge. That's a program very, very valuable to Ohio State University. That program came into effect because Ed Jennings went down to meet with Vern Rife, and Vern really believed in higher education, believed in Ohio State University, and said, Ed, what do you really need to move Ohio State forward? And Ed said, what we really need is some unencumbered research dollars that would allow us to invest in various initiatives. And Ed said to Rife, well, here's an idea. Why don't we create a program? Why don't we create a program that gives every university matching dollars or matching money for each external research dollar that it attracts? And the match was only probably 10 cents on the dollar, but Rife said, well, that sounds good. And Rife brought it to Celeste, and Celeste got all the credit for it. It went into the selective excellence programs. But how could that happen? Because at that time, one person could get that done, and the state had some resources. The reason we have an Ohio Supercomputer Center on our West Campus, which is a very valuable resource for the entire state of Ohio, was that Ohio State University had lost a competition for a National Science Foundation Supercomputer Center. And we were talking with a key legislator, Patrick Sweeney. And I was in Patrick's office when he called up the Board of Regents. And the way sometimes you score points with the regents is you sort of badmouth Ohio State. And so here's Patrick on the phone with the chancellor saying, oh, those clowns at Ohio State screwed it up. Don't you think we in the state now should create a supercomputer center? And the chancellor was a little nervous about it. And Sweeney said, no, we need it. And it turns out at that time, one determined person could, in fact, now he was the majority leader, so that helps. The world has changed. In some ways, leadership is more difficult, and the resource situation is very difficult. It's very, very difficult. But, we're going to put the third frontier on the ballot. And it's a $500 million program. Now, actually, it's a lot more than that because we're going to wrap other things into it, and we're hoping it's going to attract really billions of federal and other kinds of dollars. But what is it? It's $500 million over 10 years. So it's basically $50 million a year. Now, I might sort of say, do we have to go to the ballot for $50 million a year? But maybe we do, either because of resource concerns or whatever. But it might have been easier 10, 15 years ago to say, okay, let's do $50 million a year for the next 10 years. Although maybe the bonding actually provides you greater security, because at least once the bonds are sold, you will in fact have $50 million every year. I lied. I filibustered again. I'm trying to give long answers just in case Lieberman has a question.
Young man right here. Yes, you, right there.
You talked about a number of investments in high and given the current budget crisis, how do you relate this to the problem that we downtown state legislators, there's a number of conservative lawmakers that are no new taxes, no new spending. And how does that, basically, what is the forecast? How do you change those minds to get the legislators to be more willing to invest?
Well, yeah, one of the question was, given that you have some very conservative lawmakers downtown who are opposed to taxes and spending, how do you get them to change their mind? Well, one possible answer is you don't, because some of the core group in the House, maybe there's 15 of them, are sincere. They truly believe what they believe, and maybe you'll never change their minds. And if that's the case, then that might suggest here that you have to build different kinds of coalitions. And who knows, maybe a bipartisan it's a very shocking word, a bipartisan coalition might be needed. And in fact, Speaker Householder, to get the budget out of the House, had to get 5 Democratic votes, and he found a way of getting them. So maybe, in fact, we have to think about if there are some groups that sincerely are opposed to government, taxes, spending, then maybe, in fact, we need to recognize their sincerity and find other people. There are 99 members in the Ohio House. But I think you're raising, I think, a more challenging point. How could you even at this stage, it's one thing not to talk about major new investments in higher education. How can you, when you know what the situation is right now, how can you even be talking about major cuts in higher education? How can you now get to a situation where we at the university, we're asking for restoration back to the governor's budget, but it's amazing now, how, in fact, how we might define success. And it's very frustrating to the universities, because the universities have done such a wonderful job in attracting resources from other sources, whether it's the federal government, industry, or whatever, and you want to say to the state, you need to continue to be a partner. This is not the time to disinvest. And I think we simply need more of us to get that word out. And when you're dealing with a term-limited legislature, that means there's the need much more often to re-educate people about the benefits of higher education. We can't take it for granted. And what's even more frustrating about now is that probably today our legislators probably on average have a higher level of education than they did 20 years ago. So you would assume that legislators who came through a college experience would automatically be supportive. But you shouldn't make that assumption, particularly as it relates to the economic impact of higher education, but also the broader societal, cultural, arts, and all of that contribution that we make. Well,
Thank you very much, Herb.
I see that I've depressed you, so have a wonderful evening.